you made a good point, which is that faster is not always um, better. And in fact, in some respects, I would observe, if you can't keep up with the pace of change, it becomes more dangerous. And I was wondering if you might talk about that.
Yes, I wrote a kind of public response. Senator Rounds and Senator Heinrich issued, I guess what I mean in the government you'd call it an RFI, request for information, but they issued a kind of open letter asking to for comments about how to accelerate the American kind of innovation ecosystem. And my response, which I think is inherent, is not a bad idea. I think it's inherently a good idea. The question is, um, at this moment that we're living in which people are distrustful of institutions, distrustful of science and technology. Some folks are distrustful of big tech. We've got, news coming out about, the possibility that engagements with chatbots lead to suicide, that large language models are causing people to be still to this day wrongly arrested. I mean, like there's just a lot of suboptimal, I think, examples of use cases of AI, even though there's also great promise. And is that what we want to accelerate? Like, do we want to have put some things in place to have a foundation that is the thing that we want to accelerate? And I worried that, because everyone's always yelling at DC, we're yelling at Capitol Hill, we're yelling at the interagency and the federal agencies that they're, not fast enough, not efficient enough, and all of that. I worried that in this framework, Senator Rounds and Heinrich were just kind of taking up the Silicon Valley move fast and break things ethos, and as if sort of being kind of jocular around the innovation ecosystem was going to be enough to make it true. So it's certainly the case that what is, I think, distinctly American is that we try things and we stop things and we try things. And there's a lot of us. I mean, we're a big country. So you don't want to be paralyzed and sclerotic, but but I think there needs to be humility about this moment, because whether, wherever you are on the political spectrum, there's a lot of people that are in the American public who are deeply unhappy about where kind of science and technology and public health are. And to not listen to that, try to right size that a little bit and then accelerate from that kind of improved foundation seemed to me like a lost opportunity.
Yeah, no question about that. Now, another consequence of the administration's policies, where in some areas they're not as engaged, and in some areas they're directing it in ways that are uncomfortable for people, is that we're starting to see state and local regulation pick up, right? And so, in some respects, that's a good thing. It's happened in other kinds of industries as well. But for example, California is like, no, we're going to be out there, and this is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, and so that's going to be consequential. And I'd like you to talk about that, but also, I think there's a practical consequence to it, which I remember back in the olden days when I was in the Clinton administration as a trade official. We spent most of our time trying to harmonize
Yes.
global regulations so
Yes.
that people could say we can achieve scale because we don't have to come up with 180 different models for the world. Here, even in the United States, you're getting a regulatory checkerboard, which has got to be hard for the innovator and for the VC and for others who are saying, well, I can't judge the underlying value of this idea or this company if I don't know whether it's going to get to scale or if it's only going to scale in red states or California is going to be, et cetera. And I'm just wondering what your sense of this phenomenon is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard problem, but I would go back. I mean, so I would let's talk about it from not just the perspective of the VCs, but from the perspective of policymakers in a state like California or a state like Utah, where they're doing also quite interesting regulation and legislation around AI. We've had 8 years, let's say, in which the federal government has not passed any legislation in this space, right? So not just the sort of 3 years since the evolution of generative AI in November 2022, but we've had really no, depending on how you want to mark it, I mean, you could go back to the 90s. We've had no really meaningful technology legislation in a very long time. And in my time working in the Biden administration, we did get close with a four corners, bipartisan, bicameral attempt to have a Kids Online Privacy Act. And that even didn't kind of make it over the line. And there's been a couple of other gestures in that same space. So if you're a state policymaker and you have a constituency, either because they are the, literal, sort of groundswell, like California, of this industry, or you have people who are concerned about where these technologies might be leading, I don't think you can sort of honestly say to your constituency, we're going to wait, the federal government's going to take this on, right? I mean, I think it's just, there's just, recent history has shown that that's not the correct case. I think also, given what the Trump administration has said about wanting to be deregulatory, et cetera, I think if you are a governor or you're a state legislator, I think you would be foolhardy to sort of think, okay, we're going to step back and hold back here because we know the Trump administration is going to come with some regulation that's going to deal with the fact that I have a constituency that's yelling at me every day about how concerned they are about the children and their communities and what these technologies, might mean. So I wanted to add that to the mix, because certainly we don't want to staunch innovation. We don't, but I'd also say that, companies deal with regulatory patchworks all the time. It is not ideal. And if we could have, exactly to your point, David, sort of policies that were harmonized, not only at the federal and sort of state level, but also globally, that would be amazing. Like what an amazing glide path for industry. But let's not act like it's not the case that our multinational corporations have to do this every day. It's part of the work that they do. So we want to make it easier and not harder, but it is not an impossible feat. That said, I think, we saw with the president's, with the brokering around the president's big, beautiful bill that's now passed into law, there was a moment in which, Senator Cruz sort of placed inside of the bill, preemption of state law. And in the end, I think there were some strange bedfellows that made that not the case, but there's still a lot of action and activity around not wanting to have this patchwork. I would say, we talk about the states as being these laboratories of innovation, of policy innovation. And to the extent there's going to be any appetite at all for doing anything at a federal level, I think it's not a bad idea to at least see what the states are doing and see if things work or don't work. I would say the states have been, in the case of California, I can't remember the name of the bill, but the legislation that just passed that was sponsored by Senator Weiner in the lead, that Governor Newsom signed around AI safety. I mean, there was an earlier version of that in the last legislature, and the governor signed an executive order that, really gave shape to what this bill that he signed came to be. So there was also a process here in which companies were involved, VCs were involved, the academic research community in California was involved, and, that they got to a space with a piece of legislation that I think everyone doesn't love, but everyone doesn't hate. So let's see what happens, because in the space of the sort of gap, the lacuna left by federal action, I want to personally leave open the space for states to try to figure out things that work and don't work. And I think, California is an interesting figure because these industries, many of them are based there. That's their tax base, that's their constituency base. Like, they don't want to kill these industries. And so I think California is a very important experimental, voice in this conversation.
Yeah, well, it's also, it's interesting in this respect, and we're running out of time, but I am very interested in this state and local phenomenon, both as it applies at a sort of at a higher level, but also going back to your point, AI is not all generative AI. It's not all, the sort of the core theory of AI. In fact, increasingly, whether you're looking at it from the point of view of an AI company or a VC or just a consumer or person, it's applied AI. And applied AI manifests itself in a lot of ways. It could be a traffic camera that recognizes you and can compare where you've been to where you've been in the past, and the federal government is not going to be dealing with that, but a lot of states are going to be dealing with that. And all of a sudden questions come up about, privacy and security and so forth. And that's just, that's just a tiny slice in every, in the creative arts, that there's a whole set of issues that are associated with how AI uses existing content, how intellectual property and what it does with it and so forth. And I think, Washington is, I think we could both agree, not super highly functional at the moment. And so it's going to just leave a lot of this to other places to address.
Yes, exactly that. Exactly. I mean, the lack of regulation is other people, sort of, I think, filling it in. And that's what's happening. So we think of laissez-faire and a kind of, the way that we were taught in college or in high school about laissez-faire, that it's just kind of this, bold, letting the ecosystem figure it itself out. But the lack of action, or what the ecosystem doesn't figure out on one end, is happening on the other side. And so, I guess to go back a little bit to where we began, even doing nothing around AI is making choices about what this ecosystem is going to look like. And I think the state and local level is saying, again, if you're not going to do something, we're going to do something, not only because we can, but because also we're being compelled by folks that we are accountable to do something. So, I think I think the federal government, I think the Trump administration is trying to have it both ways, trying to both saying, we're going to do something, but we're also not going to do something. And, it's creating, I think, a confusing terrain. And the last thing I'll say, David, is, we're starting to get to the Trump OSTP, led by Michael Kratsios, released an RFI on how to, how the government, the Trump administration, should be looking at deregulating AI. So are there barriers across the federal government that are causing difficulty for the sort of innovation to sort of advance? And I think it just closed yesterday. So I've just been looking at a couple of them over the last 24 hours. And, you've got the, organizations from public health, like the American Hospital Association and others in that space, basically saying, like, we actually want regulation. Like, we want, we're in a place right now where it's not clear what the rules are. So, one of the RFI response letters that I read said, we're not sure if we need to be following we want to harmonize to the HIPAA guidelines, right? So you have a whole sector that's on these health privacy regulations. And it's like, if you guys are going to do things, harmonize everything to this. And so what's fascinating is, like, not that these professional associations were asking for less regulation. They were asking for clarity around regulation, and knowing that adoption in the healthcare sector by their patients and clients is going to take a level of regulation in which people feel comfortable, and a continuation of norms that are already established.
Wow. This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important.